Okay, so we're now ready to do the add to basket functionality. Before we start, I'd like to just review where we're at from a point of view of our model and what we're trying to build. If you remember from our previous slides, the basic structure of the project, so we've got our user interface, we have a controller which talks to our data access layer where we are using Entity Framework, which in turn talks to our database. Now in many projects this might be all that you need. However, sometimes it's better to have your extra layers that sit in the middle here. So for example, we might want a basket service, and the whole point of having it as an additional service layer allows us again to abstract certain core functionality that maybe has to do more things than just access the database. So for example, it might need to run security checks, it might need to run credit stock checks, and so on. Okay, now let's switch back to our actual project in Visual Studio. Now I've added an additional project here called Services, and in the Services I've created a basket service. So what you're probably going to want to do is download the latest source code. So again, if you go to the Resources tab and download the source code so far, you will have the project pretty much as I have it at the moment. Again, what you will probably need to do is go in and run an update -database to make sure that your model matches what is in the project. So if you remember, we have in our project the product details with an add to basket button. If we look at the code, the controller for the add to basket button is within the home controller. Here we go, add to basket. And what we're doing here, we are taking the product ID and running a function called add to basket in a basket service. So what's the basket service? Well, the basket service is instantiated when the controller starts up, and it executes the project within here. So as you can see, here we have our basket service. And in here is where we take control and do all our checks before we do anything in our add to basket. So what we can do is, we'll step through the actual code as we go through. So we call the basket service add to basket. This here is where we send in our HTTP context. This is basically so that Entity Framework and Visual Studio can get access to cookies within our session. So if we look at the add to basket, here we're taking in our context, we're taking in a product ID, and we're taking in a quantity. By default, we're just always going to send one through. So what we do is we run the get basket method. Now the get basket method here again just takes an HTTP context and it tries to get a cookie out of the HTTP context, and it gets the cookie by a name which we've called the basket session name, and that's simply defined at the top here. We can call this whatever we want, we just need to make sure we remain consistent. So first of all we try to get the cookie, and then we check if the cookie actually exists, because if this is the first session the cookie won't exist. In that case we'll skip to the create new basket piece of code, and that will jump us up to here, and this code simply creates a cookie again with the basket session name. It then creates a basket, gives it a timestamp, and creates a GUID ID. Now we could just use an integer for the ID, which would be a self-incrementing integer every time we add a basket, but this wouldn't be particularly secure. By using a GUID we get a random 256 character piece of code that would be very, very hard to desk if somebody was trying to hack the site. So once we've created our basket, we insert it into a baskets repository and then we commit it. So that's going to save the change to the database. We then set the basket ID within the cookie. We give the cookie an expiration of 1 day, and then we add the cookie into the HTTP context and we return the basket. If the cookie already exists, however, we basically try to get the GUID out of the cookie. Again, we do this try parse call here. If it succeeds, we get the cookie. If it doesn't, it must mean that the basket has expired. Therefore, we go and create a new basket. Either way, we get an ID of the basket, which allows us to get the actual basket itself and pass it back to the add to basket method. So from this code, we know that one way or another we have to get a basket. We then create our new basket item, and first of all we check in the basket to see if the item already exists by looking at the basket items within the basket and seeing if there's already a product with the same ID. If there is a product with the same ID, we add the new quantity to the existing quantity. If the item is null, so it doesn't currently exist, then we create a new one and add it to the basket items within the basket. And once again, we simply hit commit and then return whether it was successful or not. So as you can see, we have passed from the web layer through to a service. The service has taken a repository, it has passed that repository through, and it gives us all our functionality within here to do all the checks within a separate service layer. If we can see this in action. So if we look at the product and say add to basket, it's added one to the basket there. If we go to the home and then back to look in the basket, as we can see, it's still persisted. If we go back to the product and add it again, as you can see, it's now incremented the quantity to 2. So there is just a very good example of how separating services into a service layer and keeping them separate from your main code can help maintain the code base, make it easier, make it cleaner, and reduce any errors should you need to make changes further down the line.